Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. Today, I'm so glad to welcome Don de Bethizy, who is the Vice Chairman of the Board of argenx and has been a serial CEO, board member, and has amazing experience across the biotech industry. For today's episode, we're really going to talk about the role of CEO in helping to manage the board and establish board governance and board relations early on in the development of biotech, how to best partner with your board and your board chair to get the best outcomes out of the team. And we'll also talk about some of the behavioral attributes that really make a CEO successful in growing and building their biotech organization. Don, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to be here. And just by way of a little bit of background about me, I've been working in life sciences my whole career after getting my PhD in toxicology and pharmacology many years ago. And have managed research, a lot of pharmacology and toxicology research. But somewhere along early in my career, I realized my talent was with people. And so I started managing laboratories and various groups in larger companies, and then actually spun a biotech company called Targacept out of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. Focused on the nicotinic receptor in the brain and on various neurological and psychiatric indications. That company was quite successful for most of its tenure. It ended up failing in the end. I had left and gone to Europe and have spent my career working directly with biotech companies and also serving on the boards of biotech companies here in Europe.
That's an amazing background and so interesting to spin a biotech out of a tobacco company of all places. Maybe a good starting point would be, what are the major learnings that you got both from that experience of spinning out the company, but also ultimately of the failure and kind of the outcome that arose from that experience?
That was actually a defining experience for me because I had worked in a big company. I'm a toxicologist, and we had the remit to develop lower risk products. But we also did a lot of basic research on the nicotinic receptor, and it was that effort that we spun out. And I went with it along with 20 employees. And we were written up in the Harvard Business Review as actually a best corporate practice for a spin out from a large corporation. This was in 2002. And it really showed the fact that we had not fallen victim of the spin out traps that many spin outs fall. For example, keeping an umbilical cord connected to the small company where you kind of suck profits and money out of the small company. But I think the most important element was I had management experience, I had science experience in a complicated environment. But when we came out, I didn't have CEO experience, right? And so I was on a steep learning curve. My fundamental management training and all of that served me very well. But I was very fortunate to have very high-end investors and which were able to attract one of the top chairmen in the business, Mark Skoletsky. And Mark played a very important role in mentoring me.
Amazing. What did that mentorship actually look like in your first time as a CEO? What were the kinds of questions you asked? And I imagine it takes a level of humility being in that first time role, being open to asking the board some of the hard questions that they might be expecting you to just naturally know.
Well, I'm a big believer in being humble at some level, right? And recognizing that, and my whole life has been that way. I've been peeling an onion my whole life. And and one of the things I learned very early on is I wasn't quite sure what was the responsibility of me versus the board, right? It seems like a simple thing, but I was used to being in a big company, and now I'm in a small company. I have more influence and power than I realized in the beginning. But Mark, I would call Mark and say, Mark, is this something for the board or for me, right? Um, and and he had regular calls with me in the beginning, and then we drifted away from that, where I would go, a month or two without talking to him. And then whenever something happened at the board level where the board members were not so sure that I knew what I was doing exactly, all of a sudden I would have every 2-week meetings with Mark, and which were fantastic. I mean, it didn't bother me, but just to fast forward to my own role as chair, one of the things that I did with every CEO was to schedule a weekly call. And the way that works out is you might end up with 2 or 3 a month, maybe sometimes 1 a month, depending on how busy they are. I had a lot of time when I became chair of the boards, and I think that gave them the opportunity, and they learned very quickly that I'm not that judging, so they can reveal themselves to me, and I'm not going to use it against them. I'm not going to talk to the rest of the board about how pathetic they are. I mean, I would never do that, and they knew that. So that I think is the kind of chair that you want to get. And it's difficult to choose your chair, but most CEOs have more influence on that than they realize, and build that trust between the chair and the CEO.
That last thread I find is so important. One, to call out, it's very obvious that you have a huge level of humility in all of the amazing roles that you've played, and that's probably served you well both as a CEO and as a board member. For people that are as first-time CEOs, or they're joining a board, or they are a board chair for the first time, one thread that you talked quite a bit about in that last point was around building confidence with the board and trust, that you can have an open dialogue around the risks and what's going on in the business. I find that a lot of early CEOs feel they need to represent a very rosy picture to the board every time they're representing anything about the firm. And as a result of that, there isn't the level of transparency where the board can actually help in the situations where they're really intended to. So can you tell us a little bit more, either as in the CEO role or as the board chair role, how do people establish that level of confidence in the CEO so that you can have that trusted rapport?
I think it's probably the most salient point we're going to talk about today, is this balance between of the CEO and the chair and the board. And I think when you're a first-time CEO, you have some insecurity over, and what you have a lot of knowledge about is the company, and you know it better than almost anyone. And therefore, you have a tendency to really focus on execution. And when you have an early stage company, and it's often a venture capital based board, so they haven't populated, that you might have one domain expertise person on the board, but generally you're starting out with a whole VC board. And your chair, your chair will often be independent. And I have been in that role. My first chair role was in a small biotech company, early stage, all venture people on the board, except for me as chair. And that was, I had to be reminded of what it was like to have a venture-backed board, because they're nervous over your ability to execute and build the team. So, you make these early hires. You can't always get the very best person in the world to be in those roles. So you have some gaps. if your chief medical officer is presenting and it's not what they're used to seeing, that causes a lot of consternation. And then you find yourself kind of, as a CEO, then trapped into defending your person. And really and often the CEOs have more experience than that from a execution and domain knowledge. So they can help and augment, but listening carefully, not being defensive in that moment, and sorting through that, and making a decision over a period of time whether you've made a good hire or not, because most people wait way too long to change people within in these key positions, and I tended to always have that bias. I have a lot of allegiance to the people that I'm committed to, and I can see the best in them, but that also creates a blind spot. So I think that's a dynamic of hiring the right people, getting them on the bus, but getting them in the right seats on the bus. And sometimes you have these founders and research teams that come in, and many of them don't have company experience at all. And yet that's how you have to run the company in the beginning like that. So I think this is where an experienced chair can help, because they can help. And I had to do this, which is you're sort of the interface, so that the CEO is not getting the full force of the insecurity over what they're observing. I think as an early chair, I could have been more less protective and more conscientious about taking the worry and the criticism of the VCs to heart, and created faster action. I'm thinking back to where maybe we waited too long to change how we were doing things. So I think it's really an important dynamic. The other element is trying to keep the board more strategic. And that's quite difficult because the strategy is not that complicated in an early stage preclinical based company. So, you have to have a strategy, but your sophistication around what that strategy looks like varies quite a bit among companies. And it's important to develop your strategy and make sure that you've done all the commercial assessment, because it's going to be 5 to 10, 12 years before you're really getting finished phase 3. And so trying to figure out whether your shiny new coin, your asset, is going to have a valuable place in the market, you have to spend a lot of time on that. And I don't think early stage companies they don't have the expertise in the company. They often don't have VCs that have enough commercial experience. So I was fortunate with my first company that I had people that were commercially oriented and had a commercial product. So I was getting feedback quite quickly from my first board. My challenge as chair was I didn't have commercial experience, not in the farm industry. So I was having to get people like that onto the board as soon as possible. And I know that at Argenx, which I had been there since late 2014, is we really had to ramp up that capability at the board. We've transformed the board to nearly half the people on the board have commercial experience, if not more, from their operating roles previously.
Those are really great points. A couple of things I really want to highlight that you just touched on. One was about the hiring strategy and how important it is to get the right hires. I love the analogy, get the right hires in the right seats on the bus as soon as possible, but also balancing the strategic versus operational insights of the board and making sure they are very much focused on the strategic attributes of building the company and not in the weeds on this person today, what are they doing, and the ins and outs of the roles. And so really differentiating that. What we find so frequently is that the board obviously wants you to go as quickly as possible. They have incentives around that. They want to grow the business accordingly. But in the race for building the team, often you bring in the wrong people because you're just going too quickly and you're trying to fill the seats regardless of if it's the right person to put in the seat. And so that balance and getting the approach that will actually help you push back and the approach that will allow you to take the time to do it right and build that from the start. And to your point, that might mean bringing in somebody that has later stage experience than the stage that the company is in today. That might be a critical insight for where you need to go and how you have to build the business for the future. So really thinking about the team dynamics, the experience set that you're going to need, not just for today's activities, but for building for the future, and then making sure that everyone's operating as an effective team is so critical to a biotech success. But often that's in a little bit of conflict with the speed that an investor-led board is really going to be pushing on a CEO. So having the strength of vision to be able to push back in those ways is really critical. One thing that you have told me about in the past, Don, I'd maybe love for you to touch on here is you spend a lot of your time also coaching early CEOs on some of these board dynamics and how to effectively set up their boards or engage with their board. Can you speak to that last point? How do you give the CEOs the confidence to push back in the areas where they know they're doing the right thing for the business and for the asset and for the patients, but they need to convince their board that they're making the right decisions? How do you build the confidence that, how do you give them the language and the tools to be really successful at that?
Yeah, I'd just like to sort of preface that with, to link the two sections here we just talked about, is you don't have to hire all the expertise that you need. And I think this is where consulting firms and individual advisors, you don't have to make a formal employee commitment, right? So I think it's really important to recognize the value of getting experts around you, both, and the board should be doing the same thing, right? If you haven't populated the board yet, you don't have to hire a board person right away. But you can get one of these advisors to work with the R&D committee, to work with the business development committee or whatever. So I think that's important. Yeah, I think getting a CEO to recognize the board's job is to be strategic and to keep an eye on, of course, how well the company is operating. So putting together 3 questions that you're having about your business that are strategic and putting them in front of the board ahead of time so that you can build the board meeting around those 3 strategic challenges. They might be challenges, they might be, the indication, they might, whatever it is, getting the board, every board meeting, having 3 questions that you want them to engage in. The other thing, which I think all of us who come out of science and technology, we have a tendency to be fantastic with PowerPoint presentations. And you put together this big PowerPoint that's going to guide the board on the execution of where you are. And of course, the earlier you are in the company, you're going to have venture people that really want to know, are you moving along? But one of the principles that you have to establish with your board, and your board has to establish with you, and the chair should be doing this with the CEO, is you can depend on the board members having read that whole PowerPoint. You do not have to have people standing up presenting the entire PowerPoint. And The other element is the CEO should not be doing the entire PowerPoint. Board members really want to get to know the senior people that are driving the success of the company. So they need to see them in action. They need to see how they're representing things. But you have to do a lot of coaching of those executives because generally they've been presenting science most of their life and or their career. So it's really important to get them to do PowerPoints that just help frame what they want to talk about. And that brings up the role of committees. So you want to take some of the detail out of the board meeting and into committee meetings. And the and a science or R&D committee is essential in companies like these. And there you can have your strongest board members around the science. And we've certainly done that at argenx. And I have to say the chair that we had for many years was the head of research for Amgen. And he had a lot of experience with antibodies. And I was on that. I have been on that. I'm on that committee. And it's been fascinating to me to see at what a high level that committee could operate. And in fact, we had a situation where the chief medical officer left the company, and we were essentially serving in the role of head of R&D, meeting every 2 weeks. So you can use experienced people like that, but generally you're using them to listen to the detail, give the context of the market, the direction of where things are going, and very specifically getting feedback on the value of the data.
Absolutely. I very much appreciate that point and taking things into the subcommittees and especially leveraging, in your example, the science committee or an R&D committee is so critical, especially for early organizations figuring out their clinical strategy and getting alignment on the best path forward for often rare diseases where there isn't a clear precedent. There's not a very obvious answer that you should definitely do X or Y, but you need to have a really rigorous debate about the science and the patients and what's actually happening to come up with the best solution. So having those thought partners who have very different experiences than that of the CMO or other clinical members of your team is so incredibly valuable, and finding the best way to facilitate that conversation is really key to biotech growth. So I'm really glad that you called that out. The other point that you called out, both in the committee context, but also for the overall board member meeting, is a little bit tactical, but I do want to spend a moment on it, which is the presentation itself. See so many organizations spend weeks pretty much shutting down executive operations because the board meeting is happening and everyone's panicked that they have to get their materials together and they have to tell their story, and everyone's in internal sessions, and you're smiling because you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's chaos in so many companies, quarter over quarter. You'd think there'd be a better way. And so having been in the CEO seat and sitting on these boards and being the chair of these boards, can you shed some light on truly what are your expectations going into these meetings? And what would you love for an executive team to understand about what you're looking for in their preparations and in the materials you're going to read in advance that might guide people to maybe be a little less chaotic and a little bit more focused on the value?
Yeah, Kim, you're making me smile because I just got these images of the old days, like around 2000, where we were using notebooks, right? And each board member was getting something slightly different, and the executive members, the executive team members were getting the board book, but without some of the executive session board only stuff. And then we actually ended up buying iPads for all the board members, but then we had board members who didn't know how to use technology. So we spent so much time in board preparation. In hindsight now, it was ridiculous.
It's detrimental to the company because you're taking your eye off.
it just wastes too much time. And of course, things have changed a lot, right? And I think the pandemic had a dramatic impact on the efficiency of things. I mean, we did 125 public IPOs in biotech in 2020 or 2021. I can't remember exactly, but I think it was 2021. But all that was facilitated by this kind of technology. So I think I think the message is having clear. I want to start with the clear objectives of the company. Very clear, objective, measurable objectives, right? So we developed that in my first company. I have been an advocate for it in every company. And people hate to be pinned down when there's uncertainty about the molecule, about the chemical supply, whatever. But you have to make your best estimate of when things can get done. And having those kinds of OGSMs or whatever you want to call them, but they're very specific and measurable objectives. And then reporting back to the board on a quarterly, 5-6 times a year, whatever it is, going to those and saying, this is where we are. This is what we've agreed on. Remember, these are the major elements of our development plan or preclinical plan. And this is where we are. This is what we promised. And I think promising and delivering, I think people underestimate the value of building confidence in a board. Is you promise clearly, and then you do whatever it takes to deliver. And I remember, and I actually created a little credit card with our very specific measurable objectives that, and the weighting and the date due that every employee had, right? And they made fun of me doing it, in the beginning. But every month I would do an all employee meeting, right? And I would pull that card out of my wallet and I would go through that card because people's bonuses were tied to it, right? And people that are in the lab, 50% of their bonus was not, it was tied to their specific objectives, right? Rather than the corporate objectives. Whereas the senior executives, it was 100% of their bonus was tied to the accomplishment of those. So I think that kind of discipline helps you manage your employees, but it also helps you manage your board because and then what you learn, and with a good board, is if you're doing a clinical trial and you're missing the deliverable by a month, it's not going to matter, right? They're going to give you the reward for that because unless there's some specific, very detailed objective. But mostly, you don't have to worry about that so much, right? You just have to deliver. And the other element is you don't change the date. I had people in the beginning of this, they would come in and say, we got to change the date because this happened. I go, no, we can miss the date, but the date is the date. And so I think that level of management, and having the confidence around that, and you got to remember you're building the business practices in the company. So you don't want to be wandering all over the place. You want to have good discussion among the management team, talk to the chair about how you're doing it, get some feedback, talk to the board about how you're doing it. Maybe, it's kind of straightforward and under the CEO management. But I think that builds the confidence in the board when they have a clear pattern of setting very specific and measurable goals and getting agreement from the board that these are the goals for the year. And obviously the remuneration committee will be highly involved in that. And then you'll have different personalities. You'll have people who are very black and white about things. And you have people that are more flexible on the board. And you can't let one or the other of those kinds of personalities be the dictator of, you have to use the diversity of the board. I think diversity on the board is probably one of the most important features when you're hiring board members.
Absolutely. And one point that I really want to highlight that you just called on, not just the diversity piece, I think that's incredibly critical, and diversity of background, thought, all forms of diversity are really critical to bring to the table from your board. But another piece that you just called on is the cultural element of an executive team helping to bring the entire company along as to why the timelines are what they are and what the impact of quote unquote changing the timelines are or missing the timelines. We see so many organizations where the executive team is very firm on the milestones and what they're working toward, and they have clarity with the board, but then they'll have an operations team who will say, oh no, we just moved, first in human 6 months. And, there's 30 different impacts to a move like that. But on a PowerPoint slide, it looks like you're just moving a line. And so the impact to the organization as a whole is not always well understood. And so having an executive team who establishes a culture within the organization that understands the impact of it, but also recognizes it's not necessarily punitive for raising the concerns. It's more about the fact that we need to work towards something and find the solutions that allow us to get there, whether it's more resources or other factors. The board will support it. It's just more about how do we make sure that we meet the milestones and the goals that we've set out to achieve.
Kim, I can tell that you have a lot of experience with this because you're exactly right. And what I learned to do with every clinical group I have been around is to focus on recruitment and enrollment in clinical trials and to require them to provide me with a weekly chart of recruitment and enrollment, because you invariably put out this number and when you're going to be done. And all the time, it is a rare clinical trial that hits that goal because it's just so much stuff, so many variables. But by having a weekly chart that comes directly to the CEO, to me, I can very quickly see when it's starting to bend down. And you have the projected enrollment rate, and then you have the reality. And if it bends for 2 weeks, you're not going to hit your number. It's going to be very difficult to recover, right? And because the enrollment rates were optimistic to begin with, based on all the things they thought they knew. And I think there must be teams that can manage that. But in every company I've been with, I have found that by you knowing where we are on enrollment, then you can help them do whatever it takes, because people in biotech companies are really dedicated, right? And they want to succeed. And they will do what it takes if they, as long as they don't use their optimism bias, because everybody's using their optimism bias, right? Oh yeah, we're going to catch up with that. That's not a problem. Don't worry about it this week. So I think that's and that has the knock on back to the board, right? If you said it earlier, if you're delivering and you're building that confidence, then you're getting people aren't down in the weeds. Then they can be more strategic.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with everything you've described. And Don, this has been an incredibly fun conversation for me. Truly, it's rare that we get to have somebody who has been both in the CEO seat and in the board position and really can bounce off, what are the variables that make you successful from both points of view. So I very much appreciate your time and your incredible insights, and hopefully look forward to having you back on the show another time.
Thank you, Kim. And I've really enjoyed the interaction and the prep work that we did to get here today.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.